We have plenty of time for our speaker today, which, as you see, I get the honor of introducing my fellow alumna from UC Berkeley, Dr. Dee Hu, who is an assistant professor at James Madison University. And she has offered to come and give a talk on her work here, which I'm really excited. So I'll introduce some of the things she's doing, but I can't do line by line. I want to give her some time, but she has been busy. I will say, methodologically, she's quite diverse. I see she uses geospatial analyses, starch grain analyses, geochemical analyses, XRF, archival research. And a lot of her work has to deal with how communities respond to and navigated Inca imperial policies, and then later Spanish colonialism. And so we'll see that in a book she has coming out. She has a book coming out called The Fabric of Resistance, Textile Workshops and the Rise of Rebellious Landscapes in Colonial Peru. So I'll look forward to that very soon. But she has a number of peer-reviewed publications as well on some of these topics. So she's been published in Journal of Anthropological Archaeology, Antiquity, Journal of Archaeological Science, Journal of Archaeological Research. So she has a number of publications, and her work is funded, of course it would be, by Wenner-Gren. She's been supported by Ford Foundation as well, and a number of internal and external fellowships and grants. I didn't add up the dollar amount. I know that we like to do that, but I did not. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that saved me the embarrassment. Yeah, that's good.
Well, I know it's kind of a strange thing, I think, to do that, but it's important enough that I see a number of sources of funding to support your really interesting research. But in addition to all the presentations and workshops and forums you organize as well. And I see you're affiliated with Johns Hopkins University, so yes. Oh, thank you. Esther put in the link to your upcoming book. Thank you for sharing that with us. But and just so everyone knows, I will monitor the chat for any questions, and I'll share those with Dr. Hu at the end of her talk. So Dr. Hu, thank you. I want to turn it over to you to give you enough time to share with us your recent research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be here, very honored to be here. So yeah, let's get started. How did indigenous migration strategies undermine the Spanish colonial empire? And I'll be giving an example, a case study from Peru mainly. Here we see an image. This is a fresco from the church in a town called Chincheros in the province of Cusco, and it depicts the Tupac Amaru II rebellion, which occurred in 1780 to 1781. It was the largest indigenous-led rebellion ever in the Americas. About 100,000 people unfortunately perished during this rebellion. And it's become a point of pride for Peruvians and Bolivians to this day, because a lot of people see it as kind of the beginning of the end of the Spanish Empire in South America. Even Tupac Amaru has inspired even cultural icons that we are familiar with. For example, Tupac Shakur. Tupac Amaru Shakur, he named himself after this revolutionary, Tupac Amaru II. So, his example had been very inspirational throughout the ages. And in my talk, I'm going to show that, when this had happened, it wasn't the end, even though it ultimately failed. It actually spurred kind of the widening of people's imagination of what was possible. Right, because before then you had very few armed acts of resistance against the Spanish colonial regime. But after that, things got much more frequent, and then ultimately culminated in the wars of independence, which they won. Okay, so I want to begin with something that's kind of going into the weeds, but it's just something that when you see multiple lines of evidence and they're not saying the same thing, right? They seem to be contradictory. So one is that, the effects of colonialism and how much of a demographic collapse had happened. So the genetic research showed that there was difference in the coast versus the highlands. So the coastal Andean region, you see about a 90% reduction in, the bottleneck, the decrease in the effective population size. But in the highlands, it's only about a 27% reduction. And this does not accord with the documentary record, which shows population declines of more than 90%, is about 95, 96% in both the coast and the highlands. So, that there's that discrepancy there. Another sort of discrepancy is, despite these huge political upheavals like imperial conquest, you had forced migration. Under the Inca, where up to a third of the total subject population was forcibly removed from their homelands for the purpose of control, and moved elsewhere. So despite these huge political upheavals throughout Andean history, you've actually had remarkable genetic continuity as opposed to replacement. And that's very different in other parts of the world, where when you see these huge political upheavals, often you get a very dramatic change in the genetic composition. So, for example, with the Neolithic Revolution, you do see a lot of changes in the genetic composition before and after Neolithic populations move into a certain place. But in the Andes, you really don't see that. There's actually remarkable genetic continuity since starting from about like 5800 BC. Okay, and generally we see a large-scale gene flow and cosmopolitanism all up and down the Andes. You also had significant admixture of Andean populations under Inca and Spanish colonialism. But despite this great admixture and gene flow, cosmopolitanism, you also had genetic cosmopolitanism. You you have a really rich cultural diversity of Andean peoples. They have very distinct linguistic and cultural boundaries. In the time of the Inca, you had each valley speaking its own language in addition to the more general languages, lingua francas of Quechua and Aymara. So, you have a lot, there's not concordance between genetics, linguistics, and culture, which is to be expected. That's something that archaeology has shown time and time again, that those three things usually don't conform, that those boundaries don't conform. But in the Andes, it's just to the extreme, where you have such a mosaic of diversity, cultural, political, linguistic diversity, and yet the the nuclear DNA is quite, shows intense gene flow. But on the other hand, there are certain aspects of the DNA that does show some local continuity, and local distinctiveness, and that's mtDNA, which traces, the maternal lineages. So, for example, mtDNA in Ayacucho shows local continuity in maternal lineages over at least 1,000 years. So, something odd is going on. There's a discrepancy. And in this talk, I'm going to show that what you see might be the result of resistance strategies in the colonial period, in the Spanish colonial period, of how people were migrating, where I'm going to argue that the men were migrating around to escape labor obligations, to be hidden from the census, to escape forced labor, but the women would kind of stay around near their places of birth, their communities, to keep the usufruct rights. And then they would marry the immigrants, the male immigrants, and therefore, continue their way of life, and to keep kind of viable, keep their community viable in the face of overwhelming exploitation and disease and all of these other challenges of Spanish colonialism. Okay, so I've already gone through these questions. How do you reconcile these disparate things, and also how does any of this relate to the timing and nature of the late colonial indigenous rebellions? Because during the colonial period, you had oppression was pretty continuous. It was a pretty awful time for native Andeans, for the indigenous population. But it really wasn't until after they reached the low point in their population around 1720, where you started to, see armed resistance against Spanish colonialism. So, how do these um, demographic shifts relate to the timing and nature of these late colonial indigenous rebellions? So here's a graph showing, just the uptick in the late colonial period of these rebellions. Not all of these were armed, but this is just any kind of revolt or resistance. Um, and what we see is that around 1760 onward, you get a pretty steep increase in revolts and rebellions, and also the nature of them, that they became more forceful and more violent. So our historians have explained this trend, this explosion of indigenous rebellions and revolts in terms of more short-term economic policies. For example, increases in taxes in reaction to census policies, trying to capture more people to be counted in the census to pay taxes and things like that. So it's usually a kind of explanation of reactions, that people react to top-down policies, short-term to top-down policies. But if we look at the long-term history of different policies, we see that most of the time they did not react this way to these policies. That when we see increases in tax around this time, okay, you still didn't have large scale, coordinated, armed or forceful rebellions. So it can't be the true cause of why this happened. We need to look at it from an anthropological point of view, from the perspective of what was happening to the social landscape, what were the historical processes that were occurring that were made the social landscape conducive to people coming together in these cross-cultural alliances. Okay, because the Spanish colonialism, their policies were all about dividing people, putting them into a hierarchy of different castes. Okay, in the system that they call the sistema de castas. And they would pit people against each other, where they would treat the native Andeans as kind of like these helpless children, and they would think that the mestizos, who were people of indigenous and Spanish or European descent, and the Afro descended populations, that they were the natural enemies of the native Andeans because they were cruel or whatever, right? That they would kind of pit these people against each other. Most often by giving roles of giving out physical punishment to people of African descent and to mestizos, right? So they would physically punish the native Andeans who were working in the mines and the haciendas and the textile workshops, that they would use these people to punish them. So that was a way that they kind of controlled and divided people, just by dividing their interests. So despite this very top-down emphasis on division, people were still creating these cross-caste alliances during these large-scale rebellions. Then when you look at the composition of who was participating, it was very cosmopolitan and very diverse. And it reflected the general population of Peru at the time. So it's like, how do they overcome these top-down divisive policies? How do they create these social landscapes that were more inclusive and had these cross-caste alliances? Okay, and the main case study that I want to talk about is a village called Pumacocha, and it's in the province of Vilcaswaman. And Pumacocha is a really good case study because in many ways it's a very typical village that was heavily affected by Spanish colonialism and also Inca imperialism. It was considered, the Vilcaswaman itself was considered the geographic center of the Inca Empire. It's in the place where there's the highest degree centrality of all of the empire. Right, so it actually was the geographic center of their empire on the road network, even higher than Cusco. And during, the Spanish, of course, used the geopolitical significance, importance of Vilcaswaman, and they also made it a provincial capital and a very important economic center for their policies. And Pumacocha, like the rest of the Andes, it follows this general trend of you only see these armed, forceful acts of rebellion toward the late colonial period. So in the case of Pumacocha, only after the Tupac Amaru second movement. And then during the Wars of Independence, it became an important rebel base for the Moro Chucos, and I'll talk about who the Moro Chucos are during the Wars of Independence. The Moro Chucos were local, indigenous, and mestizo people who were tied to the muleteer trade. And here's where Pumacocha is. So here's Peru, and it's in the highlands. And this is Vilcaswaman province, the Spanish colonial province. The Inca province of Vilcaswaman was much larger. And Pumacocha is right, it's only about a 2-hour walk away from the actual capital, the provincial capital of Vilcaswaman. Okay, so it's really in the heart of Spanish colonialism. It was really affected by Spanish colonialism, and during the Inca period, it was a community of transplanted laborers. So in the Inca Empire, up to a third of the population were forcibly removed from their homelands for economic purposes and for security purposes. The Inca like to divide and conquer, and we all there's this saying that the mountains breed freedom, right? That generally empires and states have an easier time where you have flat land, rich agricultural lands, and easy navigation through like rivers that are navigable or the sea. But the Andes is not a geographically ideal place to have strong state control, just because it's so mountainous. Most of the rivers are not navigable. So the Inca, instead of conquering territory and controlling territory, they knew that they had to control people. And the way that they do that is they had to mix up and shuffle the social landscape. They had to break those political alliances that people have, those economic networks, those kinship networks. So they would basically make a mosaic of diversity where they would, transplant hostile groups into areas that were far away from their homeland and surrounded by strangers. So they were letting the social landscape do the work of control instead of needing to reconquer places again and again, which was the case before they implemented this policy called the Mi'kmaq policy, which is a policy of forced resettlement. And the Assyrians did something very similar of relocating people, shuffling people up, deporting them from their homelands. It was a very similar logic to this kind of control. And in Pumacocha, you have a Mi'kmaq community. Mi'kmaq just means, the people who were resettled under this state policy. And this is what their village looked like. It was very humble. It was about 60 or 70 structures, maybe a population of only about 200 people. And in the ethnohistorical documents in the chronicles, they do emphasize that the Mima Kuna communities are pretty small, and that makes sense. The smaller, more divided, atomized you can make these communities, the more dependent they are to on the Inca hierarchy, that everything kind of reports up. It's very hard to make horizontal linkages, that you have to kind of report up the Inca hierarchy, and be dependent on the Inca for lots of things. And here's what their houses were like. It was very, you can tell it was a very poor community. They hardly had any luxury goods, actually none at all. The fine ceramics were very low proportion. Their houses were very expediently built, just one or two courses of stone at most, and then with adobe, and they were generally pretty small. But they did have relative autonomy at the site. So it was not Inca settlement structure. The Inca did not impose their settlement planning, urban planning on this settlement. They were agriculturalists, so they probably had very low status in the Inca Empire. There were Mitmakuna who were specialized in ceramics and other things, and they seemed to have access to more luxury goods than at a place like Yanahuilca in Pumacocha. So they did have relative autonomy in terms of their daily affairs, as long as they, farmed for the Inca and gave probably at least a third of their produce to supply the nearby storage houses, the nearby palace, and also the provincial capital of Vilcassuaman. Even though they had a relative autonomy at the site level in their daily lives, they didn't have a lot of autonomy and freedom of movement over the larger landscape. And that's fully consistent with the chronicles that say that the Inca really controlled traffic on the Inca highways, and that you needed special badges to travel anywhere. That they did that, to prevent these cross-group alliances, these interethnic alliances or intercommunity alliances, from threatening their power. So what we see is that, at least with the obsidian evidence, you do have a restriction of interregional traffic. This site is located close to several major obsidian sources, but obsidian is very scarce at the site. And the obsidian that they do have shows a lot of bipolar reduction of sources that have nodules that are like 40 centimeters big, right? So that it shows a scarcity and a drive for conservation. And when you compare the density of obsidian at this site to nearby pre-Inca sites, it's about a quarter to a fifth of the density. So there was a severe restriction of obsidian trade, access to obsidian. That makes sense, because with obsidian, you can use it to make weapons of war, and also the Inca more easily can control obsidian because there are points on the landscape that are easy to control. But some items are not as restricted, such as plant foods. By doing starch grain analysis, you find that most of the species could be planted close to Yanahuilca, to the site. But there are a few, like arrowroot and cassava, that are too far away to be planted and to be grown and harvested by the people who lived here. So they had to have gotten it through some form of exchange. And they are foods that are not stored in Inca storehouses. They are not the staples of the Inca Empire. The staples of the Inca Empire are maize, potatoes, and quinoa. And that's how, that's also the basis of their taxation. But arrowroot and cassava are famously known as kind of anti-state foods. All right, James Scott, I think, mentioned something about cassava being like the perfect anti-state food because it's very hard to tax. You don't need to tend to it. You just have it grow in these forested, humid areas, and then just come back for it, after a few months, and they're there. And it's really hard for the state to tax them because it's not like grains or like maize or like potatoes where you can see, where you have to tend to it and you have fields of it. with above ground, flowers, or in the case of maize, the corn cobs themselves, right? So with these foods, they had to have, it was probably not under state supervision that they were exchanging with other communities. And these, where you find the nearest areas of these foods, they are in areas where you have different ethnic groups from the ones who lived at Wilca. So what we see during the Inca, and the reason why the Inca, didn't have such a big effect on the genetic composition of the empire, right? Because you see remarkable continuity, is because of the meat mug program. It's that they still transplanted and mixed people, all over, but it was done under the state policy. So this is a reason why archaeology is still important when you have these genetic analyses, because you have equifinality, very different social phenomena leading to something that looks very similar. So if we just had the genetic information, we would think that, oh, it didn't have much effect on the populace, but it actually had a huge, social effect on the people who lived in the Inca Empire, to be transplanted and ripped from your homelands. It was often a very traumatic experience. So migration in the Spanish colonial period, what we see is that you also had rampant migration, but that was actually against state policy. The Spanish, wanted people to settle down in these permanent villages. They wanted them to stay in those villages for many generations, so that for easy taxation, and for easy record keeping as well. But people migrated as much as they could, and the Spanish did not have enough state capacity to prevent people from doing so. They could not police the roads all the time, and the local Spanish interests were different than the crown, than the central Spanish government in Spain. So often the local Spanish and indigenous officials would have every incentive to hide people, because then they can siphon off the surplus hidden population, right? That they can impose extra burdens and obligations and not give that tax to the central government. So what we see is, intense migration in the Spanish colonial period of trying to escape the tax obligations and the forced labor obligations, that if you can escape to a different village, you become what is called a forastero, which is a migrant, and you no longer have to pay, do your forced labor obligations in the mines. Because in this area, they had to go to the mercury mines of Huancavelica, which was a death sentence. So it's understandable why everybody wanted to flee this. But this migration did not destructure Native society, and it actually strengthened it. And this is, I think, I'm going to argue, is a reason for why we saw less of a population bottleneck in the highlands, because they, had this really ingenious migration strategy that wasn't just scattering everywhere, but there was a logic to it that preserved, local cultures and preserved traditional ways of life. And in my case study in Pumacocha, it became a textile workshop community, where you have the descendants of the Mi'kmaq who were living in Wilca before. They were actually working here when it first opened. But as time went on in the 18th century, you had people coming from all over the Andes, working here. Because of that intensive migration, people were constantly moving to find better, labor conditions, less of a burden. And these textile workshops were kind of engines of this migration, because you have a lot of people, fleeing local obligations to go work in these textile workshops where they could earn cash. But then sometimes the textile workshops would be very exploitative, and then they would flee those. So it was kind of like they were drawing people in and pushing them out all at once. It was kind of an engine of mass migration. And doing an analysis of the archival data of the censuses, we can actually tease out differences in how men versus women were migrating. Because when people migrated, it was mainly the men who did so because they were the ones who had to go to the forced labor to fulfill their forced labor obligations. The women were exempt from those. Right? So that put pressure on the men to flee those obligations and flee their home villages. So what we see when you do an analysis of people's surnames, trying to see the proportion of unique surnames to total number of people, that you get an index, right, of how diverse surnames are in each location. So the more diverse it is, the higher proportion of surnames, it can give you an indication of how much relatively are the men migrating in migration versus the women. And what we see is that during the time where you had this forced migration, the men had a higher unique surname index, which makes sense because there was more diversity of males of surnames of men, and the women tended to stay closer, so we see a lower thing. But then toward the late colonial period, we see this kind of equalize or reverse, where the women had actually slightly higher. So these sources are just from the census data from Vilcassuman, Arequipa, and Cajatambo. I wanted to make sure that what I was seeing in Vilcassuman was a general trend and not just a local trend. But yeah, it was a general trend. So what we see, the reason I think for this change is that if you look at the proportion of adult men being forasteros, being migrants in one particular province, but this was general for the Andes, anywhere that you had the forced migration. I mean, it's a sort of forced labor called the mita. You can see that it peaked around 1730, and then it just precipitously declined. So it was up to about half of the population in certain communities. So you can safely say about a third of the male population at any time were migrants or in the process of migrating. But then it precipitously dropped. And the reason why is that there was an abolition of forced mita that happened around 1770 to 1780. And the reason why they abolished the mita was not because they were enlightened and saw that this was extremely exploitative and people were dying all the time. It's due to people already making mita unprofitable for the state. So the forced mita in Peru, it's forced labor, and it applies to men, indigenous men, ages 17 to 49, and approximately a seventh of the adult male population. They were supposed to be working at one of these mines or haciendas or textile workshops at any given time, and it's uncompensated labor. But in reality, it was more about 1 in 15, just because people were really dragging their feet in doing these things, and state capacity, central state capacity, was quite low. And these stints lasted from a couple of months to half a year. But in certain areas, in certain mitas, like for example, the Huancavelica mercury mines, it was a horrific, it was like a death sentence. Only about a third of the people who went there either returned to their home village or survived. So when they were going to their mita obligations, people in the village would basically throw a funeral for them. They would dance and cry, and it was like a sending away party because they knew that chances were that they'd never see them again. Um, so people were obviously had a very big incentive to try and avoid this and frustrate this and sabotage this as much as possible. It was gradually replaced with a cash substitution, which meant that instead of going there yourself, you would pay like 100 pesos, which was a lot of money. It was more than the yearly salary of a chief, but you could pay 100 pesos and you could get out of that. And this community would try and scrounge as much money as it could to prevent people from going there. So it was replaced with a cash substitution. And eventually, because they saw that um, it was just not working for the state, it was formally abolished. Okay. And the reason why it was abolished was they were just so effective at evading the Mita. You had strategic migrations, you had people hiding tributaries, you had foot dragging of just, not ending up there when you're supposed to go there, that on the way there, you just flee to another village where you have friends and family and just, remain hidden to the state, just general non-compliance. So what these strategies did was led to the costs of enforcing Mita exceeding actually the monetary value of the labor of the people who were supposed to go there. So the state tried to figure out other ways of capturing that labor and that unrealized money. So they replaced it with legalizing the reparto system. So the reparto system was also extremely exploitative. They it forced people to indigenous people to purchase goods that they didn't need, like toothbrushes and um, mules and European textiles, luxury goods for very high prices. So they would mark the value up 2 to 4 times. And of course, people could not pay up, so they would give in cash advances. And then because they couldn't pay back that tax, but those loans, they would end up in debtors' prisons. And textile workshops were the #1 form of a prison for the people who could not pay up. So it's kind of a reparto to prison pipeline that they had going on. And this was harder to escape because even if you migrated, the local officials would still force you to buy these goods. You could not escape it just by fleeing to another village. No longer was forastero status protecting you from this policy. Um, so it was harder to evade, and what it led to was just a swelling of the prison population in these textile workshops called obrajes. Here we have an image of Potosi, which was another famous silver mine in Bolivia. And these textile workshops would send textiles to these markets where they would sell for a lot of good money. And so these textile workshops were using increasingly prison labor and earning these great profits. Okay, so let's break each of these strategies down. So first you had these strategic circulatory and exogamous migration networks, these kinship networks. And so this is a little hard to read, but what it is that there's a census, a representation of a census from the 1680s of these 4 villages. And they actually listed who the forasteros were and where they came from and where they were born, which were often different places. So when you mapped out where they were coming from and where they were born, you could see that they were in the same migration network. So some people who were born in a village, in Cusco, they would have this, other people from a different family in the same village who have grandparents who came from that place, right? So there was a limited set of villages that they were coming from and provinces that they were coming from. But it was all known in this sort of network. And that makes sense. If you want to flee your labor obligations, you generally want to make sure that the place you end up will have people to receive you, right? You don't want to just randomly flee somewhere because you might die if you don't know anybody. So it makes sense that people were circulating, in these sets of villages that were known and that you have friends and distant family there who could receive you. Okay, so it was kind of ingenious because once the forasteros moved to this village, they have friends and family, distant family there who could get them set up, and then they marry the women there who have the rights to the communal lands, and therefore, they can, be a stable presence there because they don't have to go to the forced labor. but they also still have access to the communal lands through marriage. So it was a sort of the best of both worlds, trying to make a terrible situation more manageable. And another census, two censuses, one from 1719 and 1729 of the same villages in Vilcassuman. I compared the two censuses to see, if I can track people moving to different villages. It was very hard to do because of the discrepancies I've told you before about hiding tributaries. So I think out of something like 2,100 tributaries who are heads of family, male heads of family, I think you only had like 300 of them that had the same first name and surname in the second census, just 10 years apart. And out of those 300 or so, maybe only 216 probably refer to the same person. So there should be a lot more continuity than there is because of these census evasion tactics. Of course, you did have a huge demographic shock that occurred from 1719 to 1726, which was a great Andean epidemic, which killed up to 40% of the total population in the Andes. But that still does not explain why you have so little concordance. But despite that, you can track the people who did migrate inside the province. And what we see is that when you did have the migration, they almost always migrated to a different kind of census unit, a different repartimiento, right? Because each repartimiento was kind of autonomous in who was doing the record keeping, who was doing the tax collection and all that. So people were moving when they did move to a different repartimiento. And remember, these are repartimientos were modeled on Inca juridical counties. And these counties were based on ethnic groups. So essentially, they were not migrating to repartimientos of the same ethnic group, right? They were migrating to other repartimientos, the homelands of different ethnic groups. Okay, because there was that incentive that to evade the census, you had to move to a different repartimiento. And then the people who moved inside the same repartimiento, they were almost all chiefs who were exempt from the forced labor anyway. Okay, so it seemed like the ordinary people were motivated to move, if they did move inside the province, to a different repartimiento. Of course, a lot of migration probably occurred outside of the province, but we don't have access to that, right? That's a spotty documentary record. We don't have other censuses that are this detailed in neighboring areas during the same time period. But just note that, these different clusters of migration, they are not geographically clustered. Again, it's that expansive circulatory strategic migration that we saw on the larger landscape playing out inside the province. Okay, that people aren't just migrating within their little counties, they were trying to, get as far as possible. Okay. Which leads us to talk about the Morochucos, who were from the Vilcassuman. Okay, they were motivated against the reparto system because they were the muleteers who, brought goods to and from textile workshops. They were motivated against the reparto system because they were forced to buy mules at elevated prices. So they were heavily affected, and a lot of them were put into these debtor prisons. Okay, so their former employers basically became their prisoners. And they were pivotal to winning the wars of independence in South America. They fought decisively in the last battle of the wars of independence in Quinua and near Ayacucho, and they were at the vanguard of the people who, charged against the Spanish. And they're generally cast as bearded mestizo or white cowboys whose primary language is Quechua, an indigenous language. So here's an image of what people's romantic idea of what these Morochucos look like. They basically paint them as basic Spanish, cowboys. Okay. Here's a Morochuco from modern Vilcassuman. And they're noted as, that they're mestizo because they have beards. And generally the stereotype is that if you're indigenous, if if you're mainly indigenous, you don't have a full beard. And their traditional homelands were renamed Los Morochucos in honor of them, and they received privileges and honors and benefits after the wars of independence. And they're still very revered to this day in this area. One of their leaders was called Basilio Auqui. He was one of the famous leaders who fought and died in the wars of independence. And here's a statue they erected for him in one of the villages. But the question is, has history overlooked the indigenous and the female Morochucos? Have they maybe not given the full view of who the Morochucos were? Are there racial biases? So, let's look at this from a historical anthropological point of view. So the ethnogenesis of the Morochucos. So here, this is where the traditional homeland of the Morochucos are, the Pampa de Cangallo. The Pampa of Cangallo is like a flat area, where you have this culture. And so the traditional narratives are that they're descendants of the conquistadors, specifically the Almagro faction in the Pizarro-Almagro Civil War of the 1530s and 40s, right? These narratives really emphasize their Europeanness. And if you look at where they are, this traditional homeland, you can see that it's a higher proportion of castas or mestizos and Spanish. And so yeah, it corresponds to higher mestizo Spanish presence and the presence of these haciendas, estancias, and textile workshops that are owned by the Spanish. So this is around the time of independence. Okay, this is where their homeland is. So what migrations occurred during Morochuco ethnogenesis? We have two censuses from 1792 and 1826, right when the Morochucos became this identifiable category, at least from the outside. Outsiders started calling this group Morochucos. And what we see is, a lot of intra-provincial migration during this time period that's related to actually textile workshops becoming more defunct. So their prison population swelled, but economically, they were becoming less and less profitable because of the Industrial Revolution, that they were facing stiff competition from cheaper imports. And what was happening was here we see a lot of people probably you have a huge population decrease down here south, and then a huge population increase where the Morochucos supposedly, their homelands are. And this migration appeared internal to the province because the changes in the total population did not change much from one census to another. It remained the same, but it just seemed like people were just shuffling around where they are. And then if you look at the surname clusters and composition, that remained pretty much the same. So there wasn't like a in-migration or out-migration. It seemed like the population composition was, the same. The demographic composition was the same. So basically, people were migrating in the same kinds of circulatory networks for at least 150 years. You can see with these surname clusters, they don't correspond to geographic zones. Like if you look at the same surname cluster analysis for England, for example, you see a lot of endogamy. You see very distinct regions, and even from village to village, a lot of distinctiveness. But here in the Cosmopolitan, you see that the geographic extent of each of these surname clusters overlaps with each other. Okay, so who moved? Basically, they were the castas and Spanish men, and then also the indigenous women who were moving around. And they were moving because the haciendas and the estancias, which are the ranches, that they became the primary employers of people in the province. So they moved away from these their villages to where the economy was a bit better with the agricultural stuff. And the reason why we know that the castas move is that you can see there's a high casta in Spanish presence here in 1792, but then in 1826, it changed to here. So it seemed like they were moving to the areas where there were haciendas and estancias that had already existed, because those became more profitable, right? That's where they could find jobs and earn cash. And we know that the indigenous women also moved because of, let's see, I have it. Yeah, because in the late colonial period, seems like I don't have the numbers, but in the late around 1826, um, what we see is that the women in the Casuaman province had a higher surname uniqueness, a higher index of surname uniqueness. So it meant that they were kind of doing more migration than before, even more so than the men. And then we looked at, who the um, oh, spouses were of the Spanish and Casta men. It was about 80% or more were classed as indigenous or India or Indian in 1826. Okay, so we know that they were, moving to these places and marrying the Castas and the Spanish. Um, so I'm arguing that there were racist biases against the indigenous recognition. So what I found in my research is that actually the Morochucos were not primarily mestizo or Spanish at their ethnicity. They were actually mostly in the indigenous class. Okay, so if you look at, these villages with documented Morochuco activity, you see that most of them are actually in areas with high, that are almost completely indigenous or high indigenous proportion. Um, and if you look at the villages that were burned by the Spanish royalists, because they had so much, Morochuco rebel activity, that, you had this area, right, which was, as you can see, very indigenous in 1826. And also this area with castas. So what you actually see is that the Spanish tended to punish villages that were more mestizo, that had a stronger mestizo population. So that seems kind of counterintuitive. But if you look at Spanish attitudes during that time, they had a lot of racism against the political agency of indigenous people, that they treated them like children. They didn't think that they could have any political agency and that they could plan revolts and rebellions, that if they did participate, that it was because a mestizo or a Spanish a person put them up to it, that they were not the leaders, but other people put them up to it. And so what they would do is that you could see the proportion of um, people, communities that were punished by being burned down, that they tended to happen in areas that were more casta. So that makes sense because the Spanish thought that, we wanted to take care of the leaders of the rebels. So they punished people in villages that had a higher casta concentration. But what we see is that, it's all over, and most of the Morochucos, 80% in these documented Morochuco communities were considered indigenous. Okay, so the traditional narratives and the state favoring the mestizo and the white-looking Morochucos, that was a reflection of the racist biases of the previous colonial regime. Okay, so in conclusion, um, despite adopting many of the governance structures of the Inca, like inheriting, those same kind of ethnic repartimiento county designations, and also the Mita was based on Inca corvée labor. Native migration under Spanish colonialism was very different, was qualitatively different. The strategic migration that was exogamous, it blunted the sting of exploitation, and it kept these native Andean communities viable and dynamic and very cosmopolitan. And that men and women migrated in different ways under Spanish colonialism, and that this changed over time. And this is something we can't see unless we do these kind of fine-grained analyses. We miss these kind of hidden narratives. And that women's increased mobility in the late colonial period played a key role in the ethnogenesis of cosmopolitan identities like the Morochucos, who proved pivotal in winning the wars of independence of South America. And that's because, the reason why the Morochucos, even if some of them look white, only speak Quechua, is that they were indigenized by the mothers who were primarily indigenous. So their increased mobility, so now they can move away from their villages and not have to worry about losing communal lands, right, to the state or to other villages. Now the women don't have that pressure anymore to kind of remain in their villages. They can move around to search for better economic opportunities. They can intermarry more freely, and that's what we see in the late colonial period. Is this added cosmopolitanism, and not just the men, which occurred throughout the colonial period, but also now of the women. Their increased mobility helped create these new identities like the Morochucos, where they actually indigenize, people who are considered white looking or considered mestizo, that they indigenize the cultures of those caste categories. So yeah, that is all.
I didn't want to cut you off, Dr. Who. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
sorry. I knew I was running a little over
I
time. I'm
know
sorry.
you have a lot to talk about. You just wrote a book on this, right?
Yeah.
So we do have like 4 minutes left, I think, for some questions. I don't see any in the thread, but I will, maybe somebody has a question. Um,
Yeah, and I'm happy to stay a little after since I did go over time.
a thought came to my mind. Obviously, I work in the Maya area, and I see a lot of similarities here during that colonial period. Some of these kind of reactions to
Hmm.
the kind of burden, the labor, the demands, the labor and the tax demands, where there were these documented grievances on the part
Hmm.
of the Spanish. They were very aggravated, the Maya that kept taken to the bush, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
whenever the demands were just got to be too much, they would leave. And so
Hmm.
see them kind of really frustrated by that. And the same thing, the Maya had networks. They had
Hmm.
extended kin and villages elsewhere. And so then the encomenderos, the clergy, would have to kind of try to coax them back by lessening their demands. So they did have a level of agency and power that I think often doesn't go recognized.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the Maya is so interesting because they knew of these tactics even before Spanish colonialism. I mean, the collapse of the classic Maya was basically people voting with their feet.
Yep.
So they knew of these tactics, and um, yeah, that oftentimes, the way that indigenous peoples are portrayed in history is that they're reactive. They react to exploitation. They react to different policies. You don't really see them portrayed as being very ingenious and kind of anticipating how to combat these exploitative practices. Because with the strategic migration, it was something that happened continuously, whether there were certain policies or not, just because they knew that it created a more resistant landscape to exploitation and made sure that that their labor was scarce if you could not give better working conditions. And that's what they've actually forced the crown to react to them by issuing new decrees, by abolishing the mita, by imposing these laws against unscrupulous people trying to illegally force people to work, things like that. So it's actually the state is reacting to what's happening on the ground.
And I don't want to, if anybody else has a question, please interrupt me. Dr. I had a question because you're now in all the archival research, which, by the way, I think it's really neat to see you bringing together the lithic analysis. I know you were like sourcing obsidian, you're doing the geospatial stuff, you're integrating the archival research, which I think is really cool how you're bringing all that together to kind of tell this story. In the archival research, I wonder, because I know in the Maya area, you can see indigenous Maya trying to navigate Spanish courts, trying to bring cases, trying to now utilize these new institutions in their own to further their own kind of their own needs. And so do you see that here where they are trying to bring cases to the courts? They're trying to,
Mhm.
are they showing up
Yeah.
in these court documents like that?
Yeah, yeah, there are a lot of petitions and complaints. That's actually how we know. And oftentimes, when they don't get a favorable decision, they would literally abandon the place until they got what they wanted, and then they would come back. And actually, a lot of times, these legal petitions they involve most of the time actually intercaste alliances. Right. So it's something very contradictory where sometimes they would use the language of the Spanish, divide and control, where they would say, oh, yeah, these people who are oppressing us, it's because they're mestizos and they're cruel people. Right. But then if you look at actually what they did is that they're partnering up with mestizos and Spaniards to go against this other faction. Right. So it's like they're actually employing all this. So actually, the legal cases help them create these cross-caste alliances that often are, become even more activated when they need to act en masse forcefully. That we see it's the same people who were, in these petitions, then rebelling or joining in on the larger rebellions. That those networks were already formed during these legal cases. And that makes sense. In a legal case, you need to have, martial witnesses, allies, resources, places to stay, all these things that actually expand your political network.
Yeah, yeah, really neat. So it's 12:30 now. If anybody wants to stay on for a minute or two and talk to Dr. Who or raise a question, please feel free. But if you are leaving and signing off, I want to just say thank you again to Dr. Who for coming to talk to us here at UNLV. You have the link to the book, which is coming out, so we can see more of this story. I know she only gave us a glimpse of it. There's clearly a lot to talk about, so thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. So yeah, I see a question from Liam Johnson. Let's see. Did
Oh,
you start
yes.
this project with
Go ahead. Yes, I was supposed to do that for you. I'm sorry, but you're
oh,
on it. Go
yeah, no, now that people who wanted to leave can leave now. Just moving on. See, did you start this project with the intention of incorporating so many different lines of inquiry, or was that a breadth of methods, subdisciplines, a result of the complexity? Yeah, it was definitely a result of the complexity. When you come across these documents and uh, uh, the the archaeological material, some of the things I already knew, like the XRF, and lithic analysis, but a lot of the other things, I needed to marshal help and have people, help me extract starch grains, right? People at Berkeley, and then the people in Peru to analyze and identify. And with the archival documents, learning things like surname, um, Lasker distance analysis, learning how to code that in R. Yeah, all of these things I had to kind of learn to try and get as much as I could through these sources. So yeah, it was a result of the complexity, and it was at times very hard to kind of draw everything together. Um, that a lot of things I found that were completely unexpected. Like I could not find it anywhere else. I didn't come across it in the literature anywhere else yet about this differences in the migration patterns of men and women. That was not anywhere else, but I found very strong indicators of that through these statistical analysis of these colonial censuses.
All right, and then another question here from Aurora is what sparked your interest in Latin American cultures and the subsequent struggles indigenous peoples had with the Spanish?
Oh, yeah. So actually, when I was an undergraduate, I had gone to Peru to do research in a highland village near Vilcaswan, a different village than my dissertation site. A village of a friend from Ayacucho, and so I had done some research on the history of that area, and I noticed that there were all of these different ethnic groups in the area in the colonial period, but then nobody called themselves by those ethnic group names now. but clearly they were descendants of those people because they shared the same surnames that were,
Mm.
pretty distinct to certain ethnic groups. And so that got me thinking, why did this change? What were these processes that change? And then notice that this happened around the time of these general rebellions in the late colonial period. So these things, really interested me. But on a personal level, it's also, um, I'm from China originally. I'm from Hunan, and my father was a peasant. And his family was forcibly migrated from their home village because the state wanted to build a dam, right? And it would submerge his ancestral village, so he had to actually move. And then after he moved, then the Great Leap Forward happened, and then they were forcibly moved to a commune. Right. So there
Mm.
was that kind of resonance that I didn't set out to find this, right? But just that once I had these documents and these sets of questions, that my lines of inquiry went in that direction, because that's what I'm interested in sort of how bottom up social processes interact with these top down policies and relocation, and things like that, and how ethnogenesis could form during these times of upheaval. So yeah, that's I think it didn't spark it, but it kind of guided it in certain directions.
Yeah, I definitely feel that because I know that happened in Mexico too. There's still like a lot of Mayan Aztec peoples there, and they speak like hundreds of languages.
Mhm.
And being that like my father came from Mexico and he immigrated here, that's one of the reasons why I came to this talk is because
Mhm.
I feel very personally about these struggles as well.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, no, it's a story I think that indigenous peoples face all over the world, because my dad, he's from an area where you have this ethnic minority, indigenous ethnic minority called the Tuja, and one day when we were visiting that area, he realized that they were cooking the same food that his parents had cooked, and they spoke the same dialect. And he asked them, is your dialect the same as like the people from so and so, city, so and so area? And they said, yeah, that it's basically the same. And then a few years later, we both took a genetic test, and found that my dad is in that cluster, the Tuja cluster. So even though he is Han Chinese, it was a Hanization of what of that indigenous ancestry. So that was just just really, and that's something I found out in grad school, that there's this resonance between that and the research I was doing. Just of changes in identity coming out from these very rich and sometimes very painful histories, but it's always hopeful in the end. When people realize that they have these connections, to find points of commonality with people that the state wants you to feel an antipathy toward.
All right. Does anybody else have a question? Um, okay, so I know that I have to run off and teach, and I'm sure Dr. Hu, you are also busy. So I want to thank you again for giving us this time and even staying over a few minutes. And I look forward to seeing you soon when the world returns, maybe at a conference or whatever,
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, no, I would love to visit Las Vegas, in
Yeah,
the
yeah. If we
future.
could do like an
And
in-person,
anybody's
I know.
welcome here at James Madison in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley.
Okay, thank
Mhm.
you. Yeah, if you want to come out, just not in the summer, we'll have to get you out here in the spring or something.
Yeah.
All
Well,
right.
thank you all so
Thank you,
much.
everyone, and thank you again, Dr. Hu. It's good to see you.
Mhm. Yeah, good to see you too, Dr. Johnson.